So as we prepare to begin our time together, I want to talk a little bit about kind of where this course comes from. Some of you are veterans of our particular approach to thinking about musical theater from a theological perspective, so that won't be new to you. We're going to catch the rest of you up on this and are excited about the contributions you'll bring to this. But as Peter said, this is a sort of an extension of a course that he and I have now taught twice together, and I've taught it once, an abbreviated version on my own at Trinity. But this kind of out of our most recent iteration of the course at Vancouver School of Theology this summer, started thinking about, what would our B-sides be? There's a ton of shows that we didn't get to talk about the first time around and wanted to be able to talk about. And those of you in the U.S., actually, I think all of us are aware that we're much more cognizant of questions of race and racial representation and racial dialogue. That's a polite term for some of the justice work that we're working on, certainly in the U.S. context, and I think also not just in the U.S. context. So as I was talking with some members of my staff, I thought, there's actually, we ended up talking quite a lot about race in our first version of this course. We talk a lot about race, we talk a lot about gender, we talk a lot about sexual orientation, some of the ways in which musicals provide a secular scripture, if you like, for us to think about how we're shaped as individuals, as men and women, as white people, as European people, as non-white people, non-European people. Musicals probably have as much to do, for many of us, with our understanding of our own identities and our understanding of other people's identities, as sacred scripture does, certainly, and as other facets do. So wanting to think a little more deeply about shows that have a particular take, a particular thing to say about race, about what it means to interact with people who are different than race. I think often, especially in kind of Anglican and Episcopal contexts, where most of us tend to be of European descent, we think about conversations about race as being conversations about people who are of a different race. One of the things I want to suggest to you is that musicals are actually a really interesting place to think about the construction of whiteness. And that's one of the things I want us to be thinking about in this course. In what ways is my sense of myself as a white American, in what ways has that been shaped by the musicals that compelled me, interested me, that I was obsessed with when I was a kid? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history. Some of you know this. The first musical that I fell in love with was Lerner and Loewe's Camelot. I was, I think, 5 or 6 years old when I saw a college production of it, and I fell in love with the show. I particularly fell in love with Guinevere, and that tells you a lot about me as a man, a queer man, who sang all of Julie Andrews' notes and was kind of just compelled by this princess character. And as I've been thinking about that, I think my kind of early obsession with that show in many ways did begin it was a very particular way of understanding what it meant to be a white kid in America. It offered me a vision of race, if you like. Camelot is not a show that we're going to look at in this course. It's not really about race, but it does present almost entirely, at least in the production I saw, an entirely white group of people and a particular vision of British worlds. I want to suggest that maybe part of the reason why I ended up in the Episcopal Church is because of this obsession with Camelot and Britishness and what Guinevere represented for me. So that's just a very quick way of saying, I think some of the stuff that makes an impression on us when we're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 is kind of where I want to, that's not a hard and fast cutoff, but that kind of early formative stuff, even when we don't think we're learning about race, we're learning about race. We're going to talk about the show South Pacific, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. And that's a show that identifies that particular developmental stage. You've got to be taught before you are 6 or 7 or 8. That's what Oscar Hammerstein says. I'm going to break you up into breakout rooms here in just a moment to give you a chance to get to know a little bit more intimately than whatever we are now, 50-something person call, 62 oh, there's 62 of us, wow. Hi everybody. We can't get to know each other particularly intimately with 62, but I'm gonna break you up into some smaller groups. And what I want you to start thinking about is kind of, removed from the question of race particularly, what maybe Broadway musicals, what movies, what vestiges of popular culture were fascinating, compelling, interesting to you when you were 5, 6, 7, or 8? What are some of your earliest memories about being aware of a popular culture, songs, musicals, movies. And off the top of your head, what did they teach you about race or about gender or about sexual orientation? When you were very impressionable, what did you learn about what it was to be maybe an adult, in ways that might begin to prime the pump a little bit for thinking about how musicals teach us, what they do teach us, sometimes what they teach us by absence, what they don't teach us that we need to know, but thinking about how these sacred, these secular texts, if you like, what they teach us about race and about gender, sometimes about religion. Think about some of the lessons that you were carefully taught maybe by musicals. And then we're going to come back together and talk a little bit about what the gospel has to do with all of that. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague to talk a little bit about theology, liberation, and race. Peter Elliott, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. As folks at Trinity know, Nathan is very fluent and fluid in his ability to talk off the top of his head. And as folks from Christchurch Cathedral know, I'm kind of text bound and tend to write things out. So I've got this brief piece to talk a bit about race and musical theater today that's set. I can post it if we can figure out a way to do that, if folks would like to take a look at the text probably sometime before next week. So what does the gospel have to do with musical theater, or musical theater have to do with the gospel? This is a question that Nathan and I have been most frequently asked since we launched this series of courses in the summer of 2019. So let's begin with musical theater. Like its predecessor, grand opera, musical theater brings together many artistic endeavors. It starts with a story and a script, often drawn from other sources. It demands performers who can act and sing and dance, the classic triple threat. It includes songs and a musical score for an orchestra, a band, or just a keyboard. It involves the building of a set, an artistic endeavor in and of itself, and costumes. And the story needs to flow in a way that engages an audience and attracts enough of an audience to pay for the whole enterprise. When it's successfully done, all the elements combine to make for a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And in the case of a few works, and for me, Hamilton would become an example, the whole thing becomes a work of art in itself. All of the parts combining to tell a story through song that engages, pleases, challenges, and moves an audience. Now, performances of musicals are ubiquitous throughout North American communities. These musical stories are told over and over again with varying degrees of professionalism and success. Ask Nathan about his turn as Tevye at high school, for example, in Fiddler on the Roof. Musicals have entered into the zeitgeist of our imaginations, and they prompt reflection on how we experience the world with its sorrows and joys, its problems and its comical aspects. Because many of the works are performed again and again over many years, they become both artifacts of particular time when they were created and emblems of the time that they are performed, with changes made to show with the way shows are cast, performed, and received as they age over time. And a good example of that would be the 2010 revival of Oklahoma. The subject of all theater is, of course, human life in community, whether that be the intimacy of a family or the dynamics of a town or a country. And because musicals are about human life, they connect with the gospel. The gospel is, at its core, the message that God is involved in human life because God was incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. The word gospel means good news. And in his first sermon, according to the gospel, according to St. Luke, Jesus defines his mission, quoting from the prophet Isaiah when he reads, "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release to the captives." Good news is not so much about life after death as it is about addressing the conditions of human life with the goal of bringing dignity to every human being. One of the titles of Jesus is Emmanuel, which literally means God with us. In the words of the liturgy from Canadian Anglicans, it is God here among us, light in the midst of us. The gospel is about how God is not remote, viewing the world, as Bette Midler would have it, from a distance, but engaged and involved, first in Jesus, and then through the church, through all of the baptized, each of us taking our part in God's mission to heal the world of injustice and oppression, so that human life in all its diversity can flourish. This is the mission of God as revealed through Holy Scripture from top to bottom, from Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, to the prophets calling out injustice and oppression, right through to blessed St. Paul commending a community of life that includes all people. God's work in the Christian way is about building up human life and human community on earth. God's will be done, we pray, on earth as it is in heaven. And there's nothing more earthly than a musical. From Hammerstein to Miranda, from Bernstein to Jerry Herman, musicals take audiences into life as it is lived. We've been approaching them, Nathan and me, as we would approach a biblical text, seeking to understand the musical first in terms of when they were created and the conditions, social conditions that surrounded the creation of these works of art, and then wondering how and what they mean in the context of 21st century North America. So this offering of the course looks specifically at how musicals approach issues of race and redemption. Nathan chose that title not just because redemption starts with the same word, a letter as race, although it's a nice alliteration, isn't it? But because redemption is the theological concept that explores how can one be kept free from evil and how can one be morally improved. It's a wonderful coupling to bring together issues of race with a theology of redemption, because as current events, both in the US and Canada show, where there are issues of racism, there is evil in terms of violence, loss of dignity, and thwarting of human flourishing. How can followers of Jesus be agents of redemption, freeing systems, structures, and even freeing our consciousness from the biases that regard one race as intrinsically better than others? For theological insights into the issues of race, we look to the work of the late great African-American theologian James Cone. Dr. Cone died in 2018 at the age of 79. For many years, a professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York, he was born in a racially segregated small town in Arkansas, which he described as a world defined both by white supremacy and by the profound Black spiritual resistance it provoked. Author of 12 books with titles like God of the Oppressed and The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone was at the forefront of contextual theology, bringing a rigorous theological method to issues of race relations throughout the US and by extension to other parts of the world as well. He owes much to the liberation theologians out of South America and Latin America as well. His project, as he described it, was to critique white theologians and their churches, rooted as we are in European intellectual traditions, and to bring theology into conversation with the reality of the lives of suffering African Americans and their tragic history. He writes, "Theology is contextual language, that is, defined by the human situation that gives birth to it. No one can write a theology for all times, places, and persons. And it's this kind of contextual theology that we're bringing to bear as we look at the canon of musical theater in this course. Controversial in his time, Cohn postulated that God is black, saying the blackness of God means that God has made the oppressed condition God's own condition. That statement got him into a lot of trouble with white churches and white theologians. In a lecture at Yale University, his last big public lecture in 2017, called The Cry of Blood, and there's a YouTube link to it, Nathan, I'll send it to you and we can post it, because it's a great lecture. It's an hour, and he lectures at his audience in the best way. He spoke about why white Christians must care about the lives of African Americans. And here's a particularly powerful quote from this great lecture. God is found, he said, in the midst of blacks fighting for dignity, justice, and respect. God is present in people struggling for life, and not in the abstract metaphysical world of reason, which is only inhabited by philosophers and theologians and other privileged intellectuals. The Christian God is not the God of philosophers, not the God of Plato, Kant, and Hegel, but rather the God of the Exodus and the prophets and of Jesus. If God is in the world where people are abused and exploited, what then is God doing? This was my question as I wrestled with the fire burning inside me and in the ghettos of American cities. Christians are called by God to plunge themselves into the world on behalf of those who are voiceless and hurt. To plunge ourselves into the world of those who are voiceless and hurt. In this course, we'll seek to do exactly that. To use musical theater as the venue and occasion for an exploration of life from the experience of non-white communities. How do we hear voices that call for freedom and liberation singing out from the musical stage? How do we draw near to a God who has created the whole human family in the midst of racial discrimination and prejudice? And what does our awareness of these conditions of our siblings demand of us in terms of action? To these and other questions we'll turn as we look at the gospel and musical theater, race and redemption. Back to you, Nathan.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Peter gives me so much credit for that title. It was all about the alliteration. So I'm so glad that he has taken that title as an invitation to reflect theologically on it, because I did not do that. But that was beautifully stated, Peter. I think, and I've been thinking more about, kind of pulling apart how musicals think about race. I love the invitation, though, to think about the lodestar here as something like redemption. It's as in the context of doing this course in I'll say a church context. We're not all church people, but I'm going to use that as shorthand. That is always at some level our project, right? I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to bring a critical eye to a beloved thing, in this case musicals, probably musicals that we love. I'm gonna guess that if you're on this call, it's because once a musical touched you. And probably some of the musicals that we're going to be looking at in this course. I mean, we're talking like West Side Story, Music Man, Hamilton is a great kind of contemporary example. We're going to be looking at musicals that I hope we love. And I want to begin with that place, right? It's okay, it's beautiful to love a musical. But what we're inviting you in this course is to bring a critical eye to those texts, to those songs, to those scripts, to those performances, to those movies. Often we're going to be looking at films, film versions of musicals, bringing a critical eye to them. A critical eye is different than a criticizing eye, although we will probably do some criticizing. Some of the stuff that we're going to be looking at, actually in just a minute here, we're going to look at Showboat. Oh boy, is that show ready for criticizing. I mean, I want to use that term carefully. Showboat is very problematic, and we're going to be looking at musicals that present some very problematic, and I would suggest some hurtful, sometimes even some evil stuff. I want to be careful about that term, but Peter's invited us to think about redemption. And I think often redemption necessitates thinking about good and evil. Redemption necessitates thinking about forgiveness and repentance. So those are all terms I want to bring into our lexicon as we look at shows like Showboat that are so problematic. But looking with a critical eye does not necessarily mean criticizing something. And part of what I hope we're going to get a little bit better at over the course of our time together, over these next 5 weeks, is what I want to suggest to you is in some ways how I think about spiritual maturity, which is the ability to hold two truths at the same time. So I can both say, I love a show like Showboat, and also say, boy, that show is deeply problematic and has infected me and those like me in ways that I am seeking to undo. That's going to be tricky. Sometimes it's impossible to love something and criticize it. But I want us to hold that as something that let's see if we can do that. Bring a critical eye to something. Talk about the ways in which it can be beautiful and also hurtful, and also find ways to love what we love. Maybe sometimes we're going to take a little bit of a step away from the stuff that we used to love in a certain kind of uncritical way, and now we're learning to love it in a critical way. In some ways, that's how I understand the whole project of maturity and faith, right? Is being able to walk through what the theologian Paul Ricoeur talks about as the desert of criticism, and come to what he would call a second naivete, right? An ability to once again return to awe and wonder and love, even though I have been willing to pull something apart a little bit. So that's a little bit about the journey that I think we're going to be on together over the course of these next couple of weeks. So shall we, any just sort of immediate questions, comments, responses before we kind of pivot a little bit to actually looking at some shows? We've just thrown a ton of stuff at you. We're about halfway through. So this is a good time to stretch and take a deep breath and get ready to buckle on down as we actually start to look about shows. But anybody wanna push back, ask a question, say, I'm not sure what you mean by X, Y, or Z thing? Jan Anderson, I see that your hand is up.
Yeah, a couple of things. Are we going to be looking at the opera Porgy and Bess? And 2, will your cats be making a Zoom bomb?
Maybe and no. Next question. Anybody? All right.
There was a question in chat, Nathan, about Shuffle.
Perfect. Susan Zahl, you have set me up for the next place I wanted to take us. Thank you for giving me that lovely transition. I wasn't sure how I was going to transition from the desert of criticism to Shuffle Along. Yes, Susan says, I wonder where Shuffle Along fits because it seems to be a musical that is done completely through a black lens, which is part of the reason why I think it's worth looking at. So Peter made reference a little bit to the idea of the musical theater canon, right? This is this idea that we all kind of know the classic musicals. The way that we usually tell, actually the way that Peter and I have told the story of American musical theater, we usually start in 1943 with Oklahoma's opening night on Broadway, the first show that presented this integrated idea of a story, a book, dance and music all working together almost in a Wagnerian way to tell a story in a way that was very different from what had come before. We usually kind of trace that back to Oklahoma, and maybe with a little bit of an echo to Showboat. Showboat is sometimes talked about as a little bit of a progenitor of the idea of the integrated book musical that then becomes the canon of musical theater, right? And we tend to, it's Oklahoma, it's South Pacific, it's The Sound of Music, The Music Man, West Side Story, right? The shows that we think about as sort of defining musical theater as a genre. The reason I wanted to start with Shuffle Along is that there's a story that we mostly don't tell about musical theater prior to Oklahoma, a little bit actually prior to Porgy and Bess. Musical theater kind of in the early 20s to mid 30s. There was a time on Broadway in New York when when shows that were created by African-American composers, lyricists, and directors, and made up of entirely African-American casts, were commercially successful. Actually, what I want to suggest to you is that Shuffle Along is interesting. It's actually not an interesting show, particularly. It does not hold up well. It was kind of a review. The plot is super thin, as were a lot of musical plots in the 20s, right? They were basically vehicles to hang popular show tunes on and maybe have some dance numbers. So the show doesn't really hold up particularly well as a show, but as a way of understanding a forgotten history. The line from the musical Hamilton is, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? The story of Shuffle Along until 2016 basically disappeared from the Broadway history books, but it's a really interesting show to look at because it's the first time that jazz came onto the Broadway stage. It's the first jazz score of any Broadway show. It's the first time you had an all-female chorus line. I don't know if that's a bid for excitement or a bid for horror, but it's the first time it happened, an all-hoofing women's chorus line. And it's the first time that a Broadway house was integrated. So prior to 1921, if you were African-American, you sat up in the balcony, and if you were white, you sat on the orchestra. And Shuffle Along changed that. And for about 15 years, from 1921 to about 1936-37, Broadway, New York theater, became a place where African-Americans and white creators, and many of them were Jewish creators, white and European and Jewish folks were mixing and creating together and performing, I want to suggest you performing race in a way that kind of disappeared then. And in the 40s, then Broadway became a very white thing. And there's a reason why the books about Broadway and race are called The Great White Way, right? Like one of the things we're going to be talking about is how did Broadway musicals in the 40s, 50s, and 60s really articulate what it meant to be white in America. It became a very white, I mean, we think about the kind of the canon shows, right? There's hardly a non-white face to be seen in Oklahoma, The Sound of Music, Kiss Me Kate, Annie Get Your Gun, Hello Dolly. Those are shows that are largely coming out of a white experience, written by white creators with white actors. But there was a history that got forgotten, and Shuffle Along kind of exemplifies it. I'm going to take just the next 6 minutes and share with you a little window into Shuffle Along and that forgotten history. This is the show was revived in 2016, kind of actually recreated and revived the same year that Hamilton came out, incidentally, which I think is fascinating. It didn't really get a lot of press because Hamilton got all the press that year, but this is a little bit of Shuffle Along.
It was years in the making.
Just one song, I'm Just Wild About Harry, would last, largely because Harry Truman adopted it years later. Almost everything else about Shuffle Along, the 1921 Broadway musical, written, performed, and directed by African Americans, was forgotten. And George Wolfe, one of today's leading theater directors, told us that he found that hard to accept. We spoke at Broadway's famed Sardi's restaurant.
Shuffle Along was the first time there was a women's dancing, moving chorus. And I went, why isn't this discussed? And then I went, so this altered the American musical. And then I realized it was the first jazz score, which then introduced syncopation into the American musical. Here we come! We know about West Side Story, but we don't know anything. We didn't even think to include Shuffle Along in this conversation.
Wolfe has now created something new, titled Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921 and All That Followed. A musical, that is, about the musical, that Wolfe hopes continues a conversation begun by the original show's creators.
So it isn't just how do we present Blackness on the American stage. I think it's more interesting, how do we present who we are in our myriad facets by being Black, by being American, by being Southern, by being Northern. So they're trying to figure out all these things, not in a calculated way, but in the most natural expression of who they are, which is their art.
The new musical features an all-star team of talent, led by six-time Tony winner Audra McDonald, who plays Lottie G, actress who starred in the 1921 production. It's choreographed by Savion Glover, a renowned tap dancer and creator of the 1990s Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Fun. He, too, took on the project with a sense of mission.
I don't think anyone has a choice to walk out of that theater, not knowing something that they didn't come in with. There's so much information in the show, something we call edutainment. It's not just about putting on a show. It's about making sure that we continue to elevate the minds of this generation and then of generations to come.
Four men created the original 1921 play, composer Eubie Blake and lyricist Noble Sissle, writer-actors Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyle, and brought new sounds and moves to Broadway. The play introduced on-stage romance between Blacks, rarely if ever seen in the era. It also included older elements of vaudeville and Black actors in blackface. Tony Award winners Billy Porter and Brian Stokes Mitchell play the comedy team of Miller and Lyles.
One of the parts of the show is our two characters performed in blackface, as did many performers back then. And it's interesting because it had a different context for African American performers, because it was more like in a sense, a mime mask is. But then those characters in that style was usurped by white culture, who then didn't really understand, appreciate, honor the tradition that it came from, and it became a caricature then of Black behavior at the time, and became offensive.
You know, to be truthfully honest with you, just from reading the song titles on the album cover, me and, you know, my Black friends, in our naivete, sort of rejected this show in the way, because, you know, they had songs like Pickaninny Shoes and Bandana Land, and we heard that there was blackface, and, you know, without context, without historical context to sort of look at it through that lens, we immediately rejected it. And I think this has been such an amazing journey for me to understand.
The original 1921 Shuffle Along was a Broadway sensation, bringing white audiences to a story of and performed by Blacks, playing more than 500 performances unheard of at the time. The likes of Josephine Baker and Paul Robeson appeared in it before going on to international stardom. Leading white artists of the day, including George Gershwin and Florence Ziegfeld, came repeatedly and borrowed or lifted riffs and moves, another part of America's cultural history. It was a great success, but a painful aftermath, as the four creators of the musical squabbled among themselves and never again worked together.
I think it's what makes the material exciting and why you go on the journey. But I think that the large idea that Shuffle Along is about is, will I be remembered? As I came into this world with X amount of equipment and X amount of desires and dreams and frailties, and I try to do the best I can.
As opening night approached, though, Savy and Glover, having created the moves the actors will dance to, had something more immediate on his mind.
We're going to sneak in there one day to tie somebody up. It might be Billy Porter.
But we're not going to know when.
You're not going to know when.
Now that would delight theater and dance fans. From the Music Box Theater on Broadway, I'm Jeffrey Brown for the PBS NewsHour.
That's a little bit about Shuffle Along, a kind of a forgotten history of Broadway. The reason I bring that in here is in some ways a little bit to set up Showboat. As we begin to kind of look at where the Broadway musical comes from, I think there's a couple things that's important for us to remember at the outset. The Broadway musical is a direct recipient of the vaudeville tradition, which means it's a direct recipient of the minstrel tradition, right? A lot of the tropes that we associate with Broadway have their origin in the minstrel tradition. We're going to see some of that in Showboat, right? I mean, in some ways, minstrelsy was probably the most financially successful, certainly the most long-lived form of American popular entertainment from about, the 1840s well into the 1950s, right? The idea that at first white actors would put on blackface to perform a kind of caricature of African-American life, and then that Black actors would put on blackface in order to perform a caricature. I mean, we think of, most of us think of blackface these days as like, oh my gosh, it's the most abhorrent thing. And it is pretty dang offensive. We're going to see some of it actually in Showboat, which becomes really interesting. But the American musical theater owes a lot, actually, to that tradition. A lot of the traditions that we associate with musical theater come from minstrelsy, come from vaudeville. And as we look at a show like Showboat, which in some ways is pretty groundbreaking for its day, I think it's important to put it in the context of Shuffle Along, right? This was a period in which African-American artists and white artists were mixing in really interesting ways. They were watching one another perform race. A lot of the traditions of minstrelsy actually come from European music. You think about a song like Dixie, right? Dixie is probably the most famous minstrel song that we know in America, right? It's a show. It was a song that was associated with minstrel performances. Now we associate it with kind of the South and the Lost Cause. But Dixie is based on a Scottish march. So there's an interesting way in which minstrelsy is European music traditions being indigenized, sort of, by white actors pretending to be African American. And we might think about, what's that about, right? What is the appeal in minstrelsy if you are a white actor, performer? And then if you're a white, minstrelsy was particularly popular among working class white men. What's that about? What was it about the experience of working class white men from 1843 to the 1940s that was so compelled by this particular form of entertainment, because in some ways that's what Showboat is bringing onto a Broadway stage, right? How is race not just a function of my biological skin color, the melatonin, whatever it is, in my skin? How is race actually something that I learn how to perform? That's in some ways the question that Showboat asks. Peter, do you want to introduce Showboat to us and say a little bit about that as we begin to kind of think about that show?
Sure. And just on the performing race, when Nathan and I had this conversation the other day, early drawings of Mickey Mouse, the beloved Walt Disney character, if you look at Mickey, is really blackface. He is like the blackface in the minstrel shows. Over the years, they softened Mickey, of course, but look at very, very early drawings of Mickey Mouse, and I will defy you not to see the minstrel show in him. Anyway, Showboat is Oscar Hammerstein II wrote the lyrics. Jerome Kern wrote the music. And as Nathan said, although we usually start our exploration of the musical theater canon with Oklahoma, really we should start with Showboat, because Showboat predates all of them. It has some great songs in it. It's a showboat on the river, with post Civil War. African Americans are free now in one kind of way. They have a kind of political freedom, but they have still an economic and class subservience to whites. And the Showboat is stratified. The blacks are in the lowest level of the boat. The white serving classes in the middle, and the affluent white folks on top. It's a boat that has a show going on all the time. One of the leading characters and the most interesting character, and in fact, the hinge character, is Julie, and she is biracial. She is daughter of a white and black person. I can't remember the genders of either, doesn't really matter. She passes as white. And really the complications of the plot are all about her falling in love and whether she can have a relationship with a white guy. So I think the song that Nathan has queued up for us, which is Can't Help Lovin' That Man of Mine. It's written in a blues tempo. It's sung several times in the show by several characters, but it's Julie who sings it. Why don't we take a look at it, and then we can have some conversation about it.
Don't say anything to your mother about my meeting you here in the kitchen. Why? Never mind. Now tell me all about this man. Who is he? Well, I don't know. He was standing on the wharf, and I was standing on the top deck. And he looks so different from everybody else, and so beautiful. Julie, he said he liked me. You think he meant it? I don't know. I don't know as I'd like you to go falling in love with some man no one ever heard of. Suppose he turned out to be just a no-account river fella.
Well, if I found out he was no account, I'd stop loving him.
Oh, no, you wouldn't. Once a girl like you starts to love a man, she don't stop so easy.
Well, couldn't you stop loving Steve if he treated you mean?
No, honey. No matter what he did.
Why do you love Steve?
Oh, I don't know. He's such a bad actor on the stage, and he thinks he's so good. Maybe that's why I love him. You see, Nola, love is such a funny thing. There's no sense to it. That's why you've got to be so careful when it comes creeping up on you.
It's like the thing you always sing about when we take our walks.
Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly. I gotta love one man till I die. Can't help loving that man of mine.
That's it.
Tell me he's lazy, tell me he's slow. Tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Can't help loving that man of mine.
How come you all know that song?
Why, do you know it, Queenie?
For sure I does. But I didn't ever hear anybody but colored folks sing that song. Sounds funny for Miss Julie to know it.
Julie sings it all the time.
Can you sing the whole thing?
Of course I can. What's so funny about that?
Oh, listen, sister, I love my Mr. Man, and I can't tell you why. There ain't no reason why I should love that man. It must be something that the angels done planned. Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly. I gotta love one man till I die. Can't tell, loving that man of mine. Tell me he's lazy, tell me he's slow. Tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Can't tell, loving that man of mine. When he goes away, that's a rainy day. But when he comes back, the day is fine, the sun will shine. He can come home as late as can be. Home without him ain't no home to me. Can't help loving that man of mine.
That's beautiful, Miss Julie.
Why, that's my favorite song.
My man is shiftless and good for nothing, too. He's my man just the same. He's never near me when there's work to do.
He's never around you when there's working to do.
The chimney's smoking, the roof is leaking in, but he don't seem to care. He can be happy with just a sip of gin.
Why you all talking about gin?
I even loves him when his kisses got gin. Fish like to swim, I'm alone one man, and loving the man.
Well, she ain't my gal, she's lazy.
I'm crazy, maybe I know.
She's just as crazy about me. Look at that dancer.
Oh boy, it's a lot. There's a lot in that 6 or 7 minutes of cinema. So what do you want to talk about? We can talk about Queenie, who is that's the actor. Hattie McDaniel is the actress playing the servant Queenie, who those of you who know Gone with the Wind and some of Hattie McDaniel's other films will be familiar with her as both an actress who was largely relegated to playing maids, also the first African-American ever to be on the radio in 1915, and a well-respected blues singer. So a fascinating pioneer in many ways, but also a woman with a complicated legacy. We can talk about Paul Robeson and his appearance in that scene. We might get to that in just a second. And this fascinating moment where what begins as this sort of musical theater, Tin Pan Alley ballad about, as Suzanne says in the comments, codependency, becomes the sign that the woman singing it, Julie, is acting in all kinds of ways, right? You see the moment on Hattie McDaniel's face when she hears this song coming out of Julie and says, I thought nobody but a colored folk ever knew that song. How do you know that song? It's the first indication of what's going to later be the plot of the whole first act of Showboat, that this is a woman who is passing for white, but is in fact biracial, and the kind of gradual uncovering of that. So Julie is an actress, right? And we actually get to see her on stage in a very sort of melodramatic fashion, which only serves to highlight then when she's not acting, she is in fact acting, and which really, I mean, in some ways, the creators of Showboat are asking us to really think about race as something that is learned, something that is performed, And yet these are two creators, two Jewish creators, we might say, who are presenting what they want to suggest to you is an authentic African-American blues song written by two Jews, second-generation Jews from New York City. So there's a whole nother layer of cultural appropriation happening here that makes it a really fascinating scene, but a very problematic scene. I'm curious your thoughts, your reactions. What do you want to say about Loving That Man of Mine?
I can like the music for being music and the performance for being performance until it comes back through that lens of appropriation and dismissal almost, because it was okay for the white girl to do the dancing, but not for the black.
Right. It's okay for Magnolia to perform blackness. It's not okay for Julie to perform whiteness. In some ways, that moment where Irene Dunne starts doing the shuffle, that exemplifies for me the nature of white privilege, right? She can cross. She's allowed to go down to the kitchen. She can hang out with the servants, and she gets look at that girl shuffle. She gets nothing but applause and appreciation from the people in her life when she puts on blackface and performs in a certain way, which is exactly what Julie is doing, and she's arrested as a result. In fact, twice over the course of Showboat, you see Julie basically kind of set Magnolia up, teach her something, give her a song, and then Julie recedes, right? Julie's kind of role in the plot is to enable Magnolia to step into her role as a woman, to step into her role as a performer. She, it's ironic because Magnolia is the character who sings the operetta stuff. She's the soprano, but when she shows up in the show at the Trocadero, and she says, what I do is sing Negro songs, right? Like that's her whole career, is what she learns in that kitchen in Showboat, basically taking the African-American musical tradition and making a buck off of it. Now, we all know that tradition is in fact two white composers handing it to her, so it gets super complicated. But it is a really interesting pulling apart of this idea of appropriation. Who can perform what? Who's allowed to perform what? And who is not allowed to perform what? Other responses?
I thought also one of the interesting, I'd forgotten this because I just haven't thought about this show in a long time. It's an exemplification of the black man or black maleness as lazy, good for nothing, someone who can't do it, live up to what a white man does, is never helpful for a white woman or his partner. It was very much a profile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the. I mean, there's a pretty active debate about Showboat, right? Is this show, and the language that often gets used, I think is interesting given our early discussion, is this show redeemable or not? Are the stereotypes so? I mean, one of the criticisms of Showboat is it's a show about white characters and blacks, but the African-American characters are always a backdrop, right? They are never more than a stereotype. That's one way of understanding Showboat, right? It's so problematic in its treatment of the African-American characters particularly that you can't perform it anymore, right? It would be irresponsible to present the show in the contemporary context. The other way of understanding it is looking at actors like Hattie McDaniel and Paul Robeson and saying, my goodness, look, I mean, Paul Robeson, Columbia educated lawyer, speaks 12 languages, one of the most highly educated, talented, brilliant men of his generation. Look what he is able to do, even in such a limited role like Joe in Showboat. In a second, I think we're gonna look at Old Man River, which is really where we see Paul Robeson dealing with the reality of the way that African-American men are presented in this show, and both using that as a way of having a career, right? This is the role that he's invited to play. And also underneath it, I want to suggest to you, winking, if you like. He is also performing race, right? He's performing a white person's understanding of a black man in 1936. And every once in a while, you get this kind of wink or a nod or an indication that he knows what he's doing. And in a certain way is is aware of himself as a performance. It's a really he's fascinating in the show. Hattie McDaniels also, I think, is really interesting in the ways that they are so caught and also able to do something that's far more interesting than we would otherwise suspect, because they're actually really talented actors. Other responses?
I think that's what I was going to say, how disrespectful it was to African American men. There was this stereotype of shiftlessness and laziness, and it wasn't just among white people. It was expressed by Black women as well. And there's a sexism there that I hadn't really focused on before.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think that there was such I'm kind of a novice to this whole notion of musicals. I'm sorry, but I am. But my first view of that was I was offended at the caricature of Queenie as Aunt Jemima. Mm-hmm. And then even in the background, there were two other Black women who also were that Aunt Jemima caricature. And so I get it, what you're talking about with the stereotype of Black men, and I totally agree with that. I also saw a very offensive stereotype of Black women.
Yeah. Yeah, what's interesting is, I mean, in some ways, the 1936 film version of Showboat really puts that in our faces. Later on, I mean, the 1951 version, which I think has like Jeanette somebody and Howard Keel, and a lot of the really overt racial stereotyping got eliminated, mostly because there are just not as many African Americans on stage as the show kind of moves into the 40s and the 50s, basically. I mean, it's actually really interesting that when Showboat premiered on Broadway, the first word that audiences heard was the N-word, right? That's how Showboat begins. Wow. It later got, in 1936, they changed it to Darkies, which is a little bit better, but not much. Darkies all work on the Mississippi. Then it became all of us work on the Mississippi. All of us work while some folks play. So gradually, these very offensive African-American stereotypes, the way that got dealt with mid-century was just to eliminate them. Right? Basically whitewashing Showboat. So it's a really interesting question. What's the better way of understanding this show? Do we want to see how problematic these stereotypes are? Because in many ways, 1936 is, there are African Americans on screen almost throughout the movie. You often see them watching white people performing, and you wonder what's going on in those heads as they're watching these. I mean, often at one point it's a all-out blackface show, and the camera pans back to the galley, and you see African Americans watching the minstrel show. Now, the camera doesn't tell us what's going on in their heads, but at least the show is giving us a depiction of a world in which African Americans and whites are mixing, watching one another in very stereotyped ways, very problematic ways, but they're all on screen together, and that disappears by 1951. Basically, 1951, you've got two Black characters and a whole sea of white folks pretending that this is not a show about race. What I want to suggest to you is that Showboat is all about race, very problematically about race, but that is the subject of the show.
So yeah. An audience member at the opening of the Showboat, I mean, this is a time when there's complete segregation, and so do they did that white audience member, perceive this as non-stereotype? What was the real perception? Did the white audience member think that they were seeing reality, or were they playing along with the stereotype?
It's a great question. I mean, Showboat was subjected to criticism from the African-American press from the get-go, right? Actually, the original company, the original Black actors in Showboat refused to sing the opening lines. Thank God that they stood up and said, we will not say this. We will not say the N-word on stage. That's 19. So it was problematic in its original context, right? I think white audiences were probably not very aware of that. I mean, I expect that they sort of accepted this as, right, this is what we're used to seeing, right? We're used to seeing minstrel shows. We're used to seeing African Americans portrayed in this way. This is just how it is. In some ways, I mean, we wonder, right? Are Hammerstein and Kern trying to unsettle that. How knowing are they in terms of what they're doing, and how much are they clueless, right? They're just presenting the stereotypes that they know in a very kind of uncritical sort of way. And I suspect it's mixed, right? Like there's ways in which, I mean, we're going to talk in a couple of weeks about Hammerstein, the kind of social activist, right? He begins some of that. It's interesting that, you know, the story of Julie is presented on stage in Showboat in a context in which biracial marriage was illegal in most of the United States. And here it is presented on stage. And Hammerstein is pretty clear. I mean, the scene, you know, basically kind of exposes how ridiculous the one-drop rule is. And that's active social criticism. So in some ways, the show is really pushing the envelope in terms of having a kind of justice-oriented perspective, but also completely caught in white people's stereotypes of African Americans in 1927. It makes it a really fascinating show, but a really tricky. I almost didn't want to teach it, especially not on the first night. I thought, oh my gosh, Showboat, like you've got to be kidding me. There is not a more problematic show in the American musical theater canon. And yet I think we need to start there, right? I almost want to invite us to start with how complicated this is, how wrenching it is. I mean, it's good that we feel so uncomfortable when we watch Irene Dunne start to do the shuffle. Oh my gosh, that's excruciating, and it should be, and it was probably not for its original audience, at least for most of its original audience. That was not uncomfortable. In fact, that was a moment of pure entertainment.
So Nathan, how in the world has this been revived so many times?
Oh, that is the question I put to you, friends. Because this in some ways asks us to ask this question. I mean, I expect there's some of us on this call who love this show, or maybe loved the show until you saw Irene Dunne do the shuffle. I mean, I loved the show growing up. I didn't think about any of it. I mean, I saw the 1951 version, so it was like, Old Man River. My exposure to Old Man River was Frank Sinatra singing it, on an all-white staircase. I didn't think of Old Man River as a song that was written to be sung by an African-American about as a white person's understanding of what I mean, Can't Help Loving That Man of Mine, right? I mean, I know that song. I didn't understand it in the context of it's meant to be a blues song that unmasks a black woman, a biracial woman passing for white, right? Like, so, I mean, this is music that we grew up on, and most of us, I don't think when we first encountered it, were particularly critical. Maybe the more informed of us were. What is it about this show that is so compelling? I mean, it was revived in 1994 and won a ton of Tonys. Peter, you saw that production. What was that like in 1994?
And Andrew Egler raised his hand as well. So I was watching people. Yeah, it was Canadians are always happy to talk about when things are Canadian, but it was actually a production that had its genesis in Toronto by Garth Drabinsky of I can't remember the name of the organization now, but it was a very elaborate, big set pieces, great actors, but really focused on the mixed race piece, on how Julie, because she is, in my view, the most interesting person in the show, because she's performing white a lot of times as someone whose identity is African American, but what is the way that we perform, the way that we are in the world, seeking to get approval from a dominant racial class, as I think it was for Julie, and she clearly learned that song from her African American family, but even the style of singing it, she kind of smoothed it out and made it sound sweet. And as soon as Queenie, and in some of the more recent productions, as soon as the African Americans get a hold of the song, it sounds completely different. It has a very different way. Andrew, you wanted to get in. I don't know where you are in the screen, and if you'd unmute yourself. Okay, hi.
Hi. I think that we need to remember when a production is done, because that is the time in which we see the piece. That is the lens from which we see that piece. From 1927 until 1936, things had changed. From 1936 to the 50s, things had changed. And then all the way through. And I think, too, we need to remember when we are when we watch on film, we are not just watching the show. My point comes down to the piece itself has to be viewed from the time that we see it, not and from the time that it was made. We can't put our standards on a piece that is 96 years old. That's not fair.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think, and as I tried to say in my little mini lecture at the beginning, I think the method that Nathan and I want to do to take in this course is, let's understand what it was like at the time. Mm-hmm. Kind of like when you look at a biblical text, what is the world of the text? But then what is the world now, and how is it different? Thank you. Barbara wanted to get in as well. Barbara,
I was just
you're broadcasting loud and clear.
Okay. I was just thinking that during this time period of the original movie, that's when a lot of, in Oregon anyway, there were the exclusion laws that were created. Black people couldn't vote. In 1921, it was the first time there was an NAACP in Oregon. So the context of when the film was created, Black people were not even wanted in our state, and I think outside also, they were not really seen as human beings in the same way that the white actors would have been. So it would have been, I think, it kind of fit the culture of that time, and it fit the culture of that time.
To a certain degree, although let's remember that there was an active criticism of Showboat from the outset, right? The African American community was very vocal about their opposition, and actually a lot of Hammerstein and Kern wrote Old Man River for Paul Robeson, and he refused to do the original production of it because he said, "I'm not going to just keep playing this stereotype anymore." So I think it's important to remember the context in which white audiences would have seen this.
Yeah.
And also understand that there was never a time in which Showboat was not seen as a problematic show by African-American actors and creators. They have always seen this as an offensive stereotype. And only with time have white audiences been willing to hear that criticism.
Right. I think one of the main reason in my mind that it continues is because of the music, not the story.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, and knowing that we only have a couple of minutes left, I do want to talk about Old Man River for just a moment, because what's important to remember about Old Man River is that Paul Robeson, of course, became very much associated with this song, but changed the lyrics as he continued to perform it after the film came out. So I was going to play you the Old Man River from the 1936 film, which is an amazing scene. And it's worth watching. Go find a copy of the 1936 film. Actually, the Criterion Collection just released it on DVD with a really good documentary about the racial depictions in the film that I highly commend to you. It's it's actually, I think it just came out this year, so it's very current. But as I say, Paul Robeson gently shifted some of Hammerstein's lyrics as he performed this song into the 40s and 50s. So I'm going to give you Paul Robeson's, his version of Old Man River. Those of you who know the lyrics will hear the differences, and actually you're going to hear the voice of Sidney Poitier talking a little bit in kind of overscoring. But this is Old Man River as Paul Robeson performed it.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old Man River, that old man river, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along.
And you gets a little drunk and you lands in jail became you show a little grit and you land in jail.
And that plan, Sam, is soon forgotten, but Old Man River, He just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge, lift that bale, you show a little grit, and you land in jail. But I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And old man Rev'd, he'll just keep rolling
So I leave it up to you whether or not Showboat is redeemable or not. I do suggest that Old Man River, which as written is a song about just kind of keep going until you die in a very sort of subservient way, can become an anthem to active resistance in the mouth of a singer like Paul Robeson. And for that, I am very thankful. We are a minute over time, friends. I'll stick around for a little while if you want to keep chatting, but we are officially done, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.